Morning, everybody. We'll just give people another minute or so to come on in. Okay, let's get started. This morning, we're really excited to have Howard Henderson. Um, he's he's the founding director of the Center for Justice Research and a professor of justice administration in the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs. Dr. Henderson is currently evaluating the Bureau of Justice Assistance and Mental Health Collaboration Program funded project with the Harris County Mental Health Jail Diversion Program, which is designed to implement and expand community-based services to individuals with behavioral health issues through information sharing between the criminal justice system and community service providers. He also serves as the chair of the MacArthur Foundation-funded Houston Racial Ethnic Disparities Committee Data Work Group, which has been charged with identifying, addressing, and improving racial and ethnic disparities across the criminal justice system. He's leading a research team in a large-scale evaluation of the Houston Police Department's body camera program. So just generally, he is an expert on all things related to the policing and criminal justice system, and we're really excited to hear his talk this morning. And so without further ado, Dr. Henderson.
Thank you so much for having me this morning, and I'm honored to be able to have a discussion about criminal justice reform, which is the social justice civil rights movement of our day. And so this morning I want to have a brief talk with you all about really the historical legacy of American policing and where it comes from, because I understand that in order to best address these issues, we must understand the historical narrative that is playing out before our very eyes. And if you think about the recent deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, you will recognize that there are thousands that result from excessive police practices that have sparked intense national debate over race and police use of force. Unease, dissatisfaction, anger, and frustration were evident over the disparate policing and incarceration of persons of color, particularly African Americans. Despite the overall decrease in violent crime over the last few years, reports indicate that young Black males are at least 21 times more likely to be killed by police in this country than young whites. Inequalities are further reflected in traffic stops, drug arrests, prison populations, and the indirect impact on family, friends, and communities. Explanation of these racial disparities have proliferated and generally fall within what I see as three general categories: differential enforcement, differential involvement, and some combination of thereof. Differential involvement explanations claim that unequal criminal justice outcomes stem from differences in criminal activity between racial and ethnic groups. Recent research, however, has suggested that African Americans report similar rates of criminality as whites, yet have greater likelihood of subsequent arrest, conviction, and post-release challenges. That's according to one of the most recent Sentencing Project reports. Differential enforcement explanations, on the other hand, tend to link unequal criminal justice exposure and consequences to systemic and structural issues, including selective enforcement, institutional racism, socioeconomic disadvantage, biased assessment instruments, administrative practices, and a lack of effective legal counsel. These systemic issues are said to result from a series of unintended or intended consequences of criminal justice reform in the United States as we experience currently. Today, I want to talk about and offer a structural and historical explanation of these differential enforcement practices and traditions. Rather than viewing unequal treatment in criminal justice as a result of racism per se, we argue that such inequality is in part a continuation of historical process of colonialism, similar to arguments that have been put before us that contemporary penal policies actually have deep historical and institutional roots that predate the 1960s. In the current conversation, I will pose to you that contemporary American policing and its relationship to racial inequality is only the latest chapter in an unremitting narrative in which the police constitute the front line of a race and class stratified social order. In other words, this inequality has emerged from a dialectical production and reproduction of colonial logics as part of a broader social culture of control. In recent decades, researchers have addressed the role of colonialism in crime, crime control, and criminological thought. But from that perspective, colonialism did not end after the age of exploration. Instead, colonialism constitutes an ongoing project of domination that has continued to shape the material circumstances and crime control interactions of marginalized racial and ethnic groups. I think it was Glenn in 2015 who noted that colonialism should be seen not as an event, but as an ongoing structure. Although late times have been able to show us that there's a prototypical colonial society, the impact of colonial logic persists. Crime and criminal justice are not immune to these effects. The objective of my conversation today is not to say that situations remain unchanged from colonial societies of old, but that our current racialized social order, however, is not wholly divorced from the past either. Instead, contemporary society is merely another step in the long march of history. In this spirit, I argue that colonial logics did not disappear when colonies struggled for liberty. Indeed, some colonies continue to exist today. But rather, colonialism has transformed over time, with many strategies for stratifying and subjugating marginalized racial populations persisting in one form or another. American criminal justice, particularly the police, have often been on the front line in the deployment of such tactics. Before detailing what I see as a colonial structure and its character on contemporary American policing, allow me an opportunity to provide an overview of what colonialism is and what it looks like. And then I'll attempt to describe for you what the colonial state in today's society looks like in terms of police minority interaction. But I'll do this in several parts. In one, I will discuss the rise of hyper-policed urban ghetto, one of the most significant contemporary colonial spaces as we see in the United States. Then I'll also look at policies that have been used to increase the entry of police into these ghettos, focusing for the most part on the war on drugs, broken windows policing, and police militarization. From that point, I will try to explain how the management of these colonized urban ghettos and populations look from various police vantage points. And then I'll conclude with an examination of the entire colonial process, and I will attempt to connect the colonial state between the police and the denigration of the colonized and their culture. Although colonialism has had tremendous global impacts on numerous populations, describing in every detail the impact of colonialism has made on criminal justice is more than we are able to have at this conversation of time. What I want to do at the end of the day is use this conversation to help serve as a starting point, focusing specifically on helping you understand colonial policing of African Americans, and then future analysis should consider and even think about how the experiences of racial and ethnic minorities across this country are expressed across multiple domains of the criminal justice system. So allow me a brief moment to go into colonialism. Colonialism essentially is a structure and a process of oppression. It traditionally involves the external domination of one group by another through forced and voluntary entry. resulting in an extraction of labor and natural resources from the colonized and their lands. Examples include colonial subjugation in West Africa and the European domination of North America and South America, as we all learned in our American history courses. But second, colonialism is the imperialist expansion of capitalism sustained by racial ideologies that cast the colonized as mentally, morally, spiritually, culturally, and biologically inferior. And that can be well read in Du Bois's 1950 piece. Thus, colonization is justified by the colonizers on the grounds that the oppressed are undeserving of the rights and dignities enjoyed by the dominant caste, or that subordination is the best interest of the colonized. In the domination of a region and people for exploitation, the colonized are cast into a permanent underclass or working class as we know it. They provide exploitable labor when no labor is necessary from other groups, and that it's discarded. There are certain characteristics such as skin color that become associated with class over time. There have been those who've termed this as the color line, which allows the control of African Americans and divides the working class into racial lines. Such a link ensures that no matter how colonized people overcome their status and prestige, that individual will always be seen as an individual of lower class and lower status. And typically they are seen lower than white elites and members of the white working class. The status is sustained only as long as the colonized support the colonial order. Colonialism involves not only the domination of geography and persons, but the conquering of symbolic space through several spaces. One, the destruction of native culture. Two, the dissemination of dominant classes and the worldview. But in the words of Frantz Fanon, who was a famous French psychologist, he said, the colonized world is a world divided in two. This bifurcation occurs in a manner similar to what Gramsci referred in 1971 to the governance under hegemony, which he operates at two levels: civil society and political society. Civil society is composed of educational centers, religious organizations, political parties, and other institutions through which hegemonic consciousness is created. Among the exploited, this consciousness instills a mood of submission and inhibition, which considerably eases the task of agents of law and order. Furthermore, civil society provides the ideological mechanisms that legitimate and justify domination among the colonizers. The colonized are structured as deserving of the domination in one form or the other. Now, here's a thought to consider. The political society consists of institutions that rely on coercion to control behaviors, such as the government, police, military, political society, and is thus concerned with the management of the colonized population. Fanon in '61 said that essentially in the colonial region, the proximity and frequent direct intervention by the police and the military ensure that the colonized are kept under close scrutiny and contained by rifle butts and napalm. Gramsci argued that these two levels correspond, on one hand, to the function of hegemony, which the dominant group exercises throughout society, and on the other hand, that of direct domination and command exercised through the state and the judicial government. Thus, civil society and a civil political society are mutually supportive. Colonized populations are re-educated into colonial society, and when resistance is given, institutions of former social control, such as the police, ensure compliance through force and coercion. Although colonialism is typically envisioned as an invasion or subjugation and domination of indigenous people by outsiders, researchers have argued for a long time that colonialism can occur between populations occupying the same geography or space. The concept of internal colonialism emerged in the 1960s and 70s throughout the African American civil rights movement, and Black nationalist movement as an attempt to explain forms of racial domination. For researchers and activists, colonialism did not end after the West finished claiming foreign land or people for its own. After the occupation began to wane and chattel slavery was abolished, other forms of spatial and economic exclusion and racial ethnic underclasses persisted, even within Western and Westernized countries. In other words, the logic of colonialism persisted. Throughout the history of colonial expansion and domination, uh, the police have been instrumental in securing and maintaining order. Much has been the same as police seen as class bias by operating as neutral enforcers of class-based law. The police become race biased as they manage colonial populations. In this way, the law fundamentally structures police action, and the police do the dirty work for the larger system. Thus, the government and its laws protect the interests of the colonizers. The prosecution of injustices against the native receive the governmental support, and the native learns that he or she should act, be expected to do nothing from the colonizers in the justice system. In each historical era of colonialism, the police and the military, as we see going on now in Portland, act as a frontline enforcer of laws that present the interests of the dominant classes that adopt a particular racial character in American society. Now, I said all that to say this. The police enforcement contributes to the broader economic, social, cultural, political, and spatial forms of domination endemic in colonialism and to colonialism. In a contemporary society, such as we have in the United States, such efforts have been taken to maintain a form of slave patrols, the enforcement of segregative laws, such as the Black codes and Jim Crow laws. And as I will argue at this point, the war on drugs, broken windows policing, zero tolerance policing, and police militarization. To fully understand the implications of colonialism in contemporary policing, I think it's first necessary that I describe for you the rise of one of the most significant internal colonies today in what we define as the urban ghetto. Now, throughout the history of racial oppression in America, spatial restrictions have been instrumental. Under chattel slavery, African lands were invaded and its people were captured and shipped across the Atlantic to be traded. These slaves were subsequently confined to plantations, houses, and other spaces of servitude. After emancipation, sharecropping, or what we see as debt peonage, were used to lock free slaves into servitude to white elite landowners. Black codes and vagrancy laws controlled the movements of free slaves and provided ready-made justifications for incarcerating such persons. These forms of confinement, however, were more prominently featured in the American South. In the North, before the 1900s, Blacks and whites often lived side by side in American cities. The particular spatial dislocation of African Americans in urban ghettos and urban cities predominantly occurred in the 20th century as more Blacks fled to cities to escape the circumstances of the rural South. The period between 1910 and 1970 saw less rigid de facto segregation in urban internal colonies. As African Americans transitioned into the urban spaces, the Black working class expanded, particularly in the industrial production and service sectors, with some expansion of the African American petty bourgeoisie. At the same time, unemployment intensified among African Americans. With few exceptions, the result was the creation of a large working class and surplus population that was still categorically subordinated under the auspices of racial inferiority. Now, in addition to the employment exclusion, a lower status within the division of labor, mechanisms of economic oppression were at work. Now, for example, during the early to mid 1990s, while the federal government actively promoted home ownership among white Americans, it also systematically excluded racial and ethnic minorities from such incentives or initiatives and devalued their properties through practices such as redlining. As landed property has historically been one of the most productive mechanisms of wealth and accumulation, these practices crippled the ability of African Americans to generate and maintain wealth. Now, vital for both geographic and social mobility, combined with pushes to make suburban housing and affordable housing options for white and black petty bourgeoisie seeking upward mobility by the Federal Housing Administration of the 1940s and 50s. Whites and well-to-do blacks were able to flee urban centers. This left many poor and working class and racial ethnic groups, particularly working class blacks, hamstrung in concentrated urban ghettos, losing value and status by the day. During this process, however, most cities were not completely stripped of their middle and upper classes. Many businesses, city services, and other institutions were still bound to inner city areas by large capital investments, especially in mobile facilities and longstanding traditions. When confronted with an increasingly and systematically impoverished black population within these spaces, wealthy elites and government officials turned to what they call redevelopment, urban renewal, and gentrification, the reclamation of urban areas for middle and upper class activities and living. Policy initiatives such as the Housing Act of 1949, 1954, that was enacted by Congress, gave funding and momentum toward these initiatives that were provided, but were also created housing for the displaced. Public housing was born out of this concept and this reality. In other words, those pushes and others have affected poor African Americans by essentially reducing opportunities for social mobility and confining them to unfavorable geographic locations that become progressively isolated geographically, socially, and economically from the rest of society. In this manner, contemporary urban areas, reflect demarcated space on the basis of occupational status and the separation of low-income populations from the well-to-do. The state plays a key role in establishing and maintaining these geographies. Now, through property protection, zoning laws, housing policies, and capital investments, such maneuvers are strikingly similar to the forced reallocation of population under prototypical colonial rule. Now, none of this, however, is to say that these changes affected African Americans alone. Poor whites and other racial and ethnic minorities have also been affected by the creation of the urban ghetto. Considering that most ghettos, however, possess a disproportionate concentration of African Americans, the situation appears racially skewed. The ghetto thus emerged as an internal colonial space because of how racism and the political economy have acted to systematically marginalize African Americans into poor and often crime-ridden locations. The establishment of the urban ghetto subsequently gave rise to the conditions that justified the forced involuntary entry of the police into these spaces. Now, we say all of that to say this. If we don't understand the historical relationship between the police and the community, then we miss an opportunity to understand how we transform the system. Now, let me speak briefly to the marginalization of the colonized groups. The primary role of police in these internal colonies is to control the movements and activities of colonial populations for the benefits of the colonizers, similar to Gramsci's description of the role of political society. The management practices rising from the war on drugs, broken windows policing, and police militarization policies have resulted in considerable control of minority populations by the police. As alluded to previously, research has indicated the application of aggressive policing stemming primarily from the war on drugs and broken windows policing is disproportionately felt by minority communities. Considering that offending rates between races do not mirror criminal justice involvement, the imposition of criminal justice control may not necessarily be a response to Black crime per se, but may reflect an ideological desire to control Black behavior more generally. Routine police practices such as traffic stops, stop and frisk, and others are key mechanisms for controlling racial and ethnic minorities. For instance, the number of minorities stopped and frisked in New York rose considerably with the introduction of broken windows policing. In a report by the New York State Attorney General, African Americans constituted 50% of all persons stopped, yet they make up only 15% of the population. Furthermore, nearly 2/3 of stops conducted by street crime units involve stopping African Americans. Walking is not the only activity that exposes minority populations to police scrutiny. Racial and ethnic minorities are also disproportionately subjected to traffic stops and vehicle searches. Research on police traffic stop reveals that Blacks and Hispanics are more likely than whites to be stopped and searched by the police. Now, what that means, research has found that African American men are by far the most likely to be stopped for investigatory stops, and that stops by African Americans are most prevalent in suburban areas, where these Blacks are perceived to be out of place. Now, researchers have argued that these stops are a product of discriminatory institutional practices that grow from and reproduce negative stereotypes. The persistent exposure to stops by the police leads to experiences of continual harassment. Beyond routine police practices, research on drug interdiction efforts similarly reveals racial bias. Researchers have examined drug arrests, finding that 64% of those arrested for delivering drugs were Black, despite whites being the majority of those who deliver certain types of drugs. Ecstasy, methamphetamine, powder cocaine, and heroin, particularly in Seattle, is one example. Research also suggests that it's difficult to explain these findings in race-neutral terms. Instead, actions by some police departments appear to be shaped by racial cues. 2/3 of people incarcerated in state prison for drug offenses are African American or Latino, a disparity largely attributed to law enforcement practices. The police also make use of civil injunctions to control Black bodies in urban ghettos through mechanisms of criminalization that draw heavily upon the broken windows theory of policing. Many police departments now conduct broad sweeps of inner city neighborhoods using loose criteria to identify persons as gang members. Gang units tend to view gangs as lower income, inner city minority youth who sport urban cultural garb and are lumped together through simple stereotypes and treated suspiciously. Now, many white youth in similar socioeconomic status and backgrounds and positions often do not receive such labels. No white supremacist groups are pointed out, have gang injunctions. Even Klein in 2004 said that gang officers' perceptions of gangs essentially are going in the wrong direction. Now, Klein found that gang officers' perception of gangs often do not match research findings, noting that the police portrayed gangs as violent criminal enterprises, fundamentally different from other social groups and divorced from local community problems. These sweeps consist of indiscriminate stopping and questioning of local residents to compile a list of known gang members. Once identified as gang members, and an individual is subject to enhanced penalties and civil injunctions. Now, let me speak to police management practices for a moment, because they're often overlooked in this conversation of reform. Police management practices are increasingly present in schools in which there are strong links between race, ethnicity, poverty, school level punishment policies. Research has found that metal detectors are more common in schools serving large numbers of youth of color, exposing these students to practices that divert them into the criminal justice system for misbehavior. Research has also found that exclusionary policies are more common in poor elementary and middle schools. The expansion of zero tolerance policies in schools is a natural extension of the extensive arrest of young Black children. Now, in 2011, there were more than 75,000 arrests of Black children for disorder crimes, such as curfew violations, loitering, and vandalism. Many of the day-to-day police practices are shaped within the context of militarization. For instance, although SWAT units were originally limited to active shooter, barricaded subject, and hostage situations, researchers have found that 76% of paramilitary activity involved narcotic work, includes serving warrants and routine patrol. The militarization of the police also contributes to the management of riots and protests through forceful pacification demonstrated in the police actions in the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. In fact, protests and riots are the most likely event to trigger police marching down the street, donning combat boots, urban camouflage, riot shields, and rifles, assault rifles, while riding astride all-terrain vehicles. Similar to the historical labor riots, police are used to quell unrest while leaving root causes of such behavior unaddressed. Ideologically, state violence is constructed as necessary to restore order, whereas riotous violence is portrayed as dangerous and in need of suppression by tear gas and batons. Furthermore, the overwhelming police presence in urban areas and their racially disparate operations are part of the systemic issues that generate such protests and revolts. Dialectically, control creates its own resistance. Now, let's speak to the aggression and police militarization of drug activity in many of these communities. The aggressive and militarized policing of drug activity essentially provides an exploitative funding mechanism for municipal governments and police departments. Now, what does that mean? The Institute of Justice reported that the US Treasury and the Justice Department forfeited more than $5 billion largely through narcotic warrants and arrests. Narcotic seizures and forfeitures are just one form whereby police departments exploit the underclass, especially minorities, through monetary disposition. Zero tolerance policing models also lead to the exacerbation of fines and outstanding warrants that contribute to local government coffers. In Ferguson, Missouri, for example, the municipal court issued 32,975 arrest warrants in 2013, despite the city's population of only 21,000 residents. 92% of these warrants were issued to African Americans, who were 68% less likely than others to have their court cases dismissed. The city of Ferguson accumulated $2.4 million in revenue from courts and fines in 2013. The practice of accumulating revenue through fines and fees is related to the carceral state expanding by enforcing civil and administrative laws. Now, law enforcement are now bringing criminal charges on administrative issues, such as failing to carry immigration documents, as in the case of Arizona due to the Senate Bill 1070. Another common form of administrative violation is warrants being sought for non-payment of financial obligations such as child support. The extensive use of warrants as a means of enforcing civil or administrative violations provides police with additional opportunities to stop, question, and frisk minorities and to expand carceral control in minority communities. The practice of revenue generation through seizures, forfeitures, fines, warrants exploits the economically vulnerable and especially harms African American population. Districts affected by such practices are essentially subjugated to resource extraction, a prototypical objective of colonial domination. Now, police departments often deploy military technologies originally developed to monitor insurgents in war, to track high-risk offenders in US communities. Furthermore, more than 150 police departments use predictive policing technologies to concentrate policing strategies in high-risk neighborhoods that often mirror minority neighborhoods. Now, Harcourt explained how risk assessment tools have largely quantified risk as a prior criminal history or contact, and both have become a proxy for race. Ferguson argued that predictive policing software turns individuals unknown to the police into possible suspects who need to be investigated to justify reasonable suspicion, and thus potentially increasing the use of stop and frisk incidents or aggressive questioning. Now, aggressive police practices and the associated over-enforcement have given rise to the adversarial model of policing, in which racial profiling, pretextual stops, unlawful searches and arrests, botched raids, and excessive force incidents proliferate as a means to maintain control and spatially exclude colonial population. The over-policing of the colonial space is further enhanced by the under-enforcement of laws in these communities, reflected by slower response times to emergency calls within these areas, and a general irreverence toward Black residents' concerns. These practices are rooted in police departments' failure to offer Black communities the model of non-adversarial and dignified policing often enjoyed by whites. The conclusion emerges that the police exist not to serve these communities, but to control and contain them. They manage Black populations and spaces. Now, I'll pause there because I know there may be questions before we go into more detail. We can open it up to questions now if they so choose.
We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Perfect. So first, do you think it's important to call on the federal government to end racist policies like the death penalty, police militarization, etc.? Do you think it would be uneducational or unrevolutionary to exclude scenario planning about the federal government implementing such policies in spite of the fact that they may not be very likely?
I think that it's very pertinent for the federal government to play a role in establishing a set of standards of justice, right? And I think that that is the role of the federal government to ensure equality for all, to make sure that individuals are equally protected by the Constitution, because we understand that on a local level, there's only so much that can be done to move race relations forward. And we would hope they would do the right thing, but we found historically and currently the local issues are very political, as they are at the national level. But I think that it's not unrealistic to expect the federal government to set the bar for a certain set of standards.
What do you think of abolition? Is that a viable option?
Oh, I think it's an interesting conversation. Uh, I'm not sure if we can totally get rid of the criminal justice system or police. I think that there is a level of policing that's necessary. The question remains what that level looks like. I think Newark, New Jersey has provided an example of how they've reformed public safety from policing. I think we need to have a national conversation about what policing looks like in the 21st century.
What do you think the alternative, or I guess what would be the ideal solution for kind of solving the colonial state of urban ghettos?
Well, I think number one, you have to address issues that are oftentimes outside of the purview of the criminal justice system, such as education, economics, income, as we said, but also access, but also human rights. I think that you have to be able to identify those individuals who don't see people in urban ghettos as human beings worthy of constitutional protections. And we have to start very early. I think this is something that we do at the elementary level to make sure that people are treated and seen on an equal footing. And I think if we do that, we're able to transform this colonial urban ghetto problem that we have.
We actually had one brief follow-up question with regards to Newark, New Jersey. Could you just expand on what exactly the police did there?
Yeah, so essentially what happened was they defunded the traditional policing model that we're used to, and they took a more social work, more public health, public safety approach to policing. And so they required their police to have more interaction with the community. And what we know from research is that the more positive interaction that police have with the community, the less likely they are to be involved in use of force and misconduct.
The de-escalation training and the like?
Yeah, so you think about training for a second, and so we know that most police training around the country is based upon tactical maneuvers. And so as a result of that, that's the way they respond. If you look at training, if you train individuals in how you interact with people positively without physical altercation, then that's the way they're going to respond to individuals when they're faced with those challenges.
Do you think defunding or perhaps reinvesting in our communities and investing in housing would be an effective solution to gentrification?
No, I think so. I think that housing is the elephant in the room. There are several great programs around the country that are dealing with housing. We have several good programs in the city of Houston, but you also have programs around the country that are trying to find ways to focus on housing as opposed to handcuffs. And I think that if individuals have a place to stay, they have a livable wage, they're less likely to come in contact with the police in a negative manner.
We had one question. What do you think the use of framing police practices as a new form of colonialism as opposed to The question said, as opposed to a new form of slavery, another version might be, I think a lot of people are familiar with Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Do you think those are exclusive, or that there's like a distinction between framing continuing colonialism versus continued Jim Crow, or basically your thoughts on that?
No, I think they are different versions of the same approach. I think that the point that we are trying to make in framing it in terms of colonialism is to understand that, you know, when you say colonialism, people understand that, right? They understand what that's like from a historical standpoint. Oftentimes, they don't see the urban ghetto as their colonial colony. Uh, when you start talking about, you know, new Jim Crow, when you start talking about slavery, sometimes you lose people. And so we try to find a creative way to get people to understand what's happening. At the end of the day, you see a lot of conversation in what we talk about in terms of slavery. I just think there are different ways of sort of getting people to understand that the urban ghetto and minority communities are policed differently from everywhere else.
Um, Apologize if this term is vague, but
It's okay.
do you believe decolonizing research is an effective method?
Uh, I think so. I think that, you know, our research is biased by the methodological approaches that we were learned, and many of our approaches were developed with a colonization mindset. And what I mean by that is we have to learn to deconstruct biases as they exist in our research methodology. We have to be more culturally competent in understanding how these different groups move and respond in spaces, because we need to be able to control for that, because different environments have different interpretations of the same meaning. And so I think that we need to be very sensitive to that and begin to deconstruct our methodological approach in many of these spaces. And so that's why we call for more culturally responsive evaluation and research in these spaces.
Makes sense. How did the Philippine National Police Force created by the American colonial government affect American police tactics?
Let's say that again.
How did the Philippine National Police Force created by the American colonial government affect American police tactics?
I don't want to. So we could guess on that one, but I think that, you know, we have to understand that a lot of the way in which the world polices, they have adopted a lot of the practices from the United States, right? Because we have one of the largest police apparatuses around the world. Um, because we have such a focus on social control, it's going to be very difficult to say that one police force um, directly impacted an entire country's approach. I think the bigger question is, how did the US military and its practices affect American policing? I think that's a direct response to that. I think that, you know, we could pontificate on their impact, but at the end of the day, we have a lot of parallels to the American military and that style of policing.
I think the remaining questions are sort of just variants on
Okay.
themes we've already hit. And so
Okay.
you said you had a little bit more you'd like to.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to pause and see if there are any questions before we finish up, and I'll do that.
Great.
Okay, so perfect. So, you know, thanks for those questions. I want to take that break with another pressing question, but, you know, as I articulated, contemporary policing in the United States continues to perpetuate systems of inequality and domination that in many ways mirrors colonial forms of control. As the line between police and the military has become increasingly blurred in recent decades, the police become law enforcement and the militarized occupation within these communities. The use of police militarization invades and occupies these spaces is quintessentially colonial. Becky Tatum explained that the police and the soldiers are the official maintainers of the colonizers and their rule of oppression. Ghetto communities are racked by poverty, victimization, segregation, and other forms. None of these issues, however, are remedied by such occupation. Police operations appear to focus on containment urban people and problems rather than resolving the structural forms of oppression that have shaped these spaces. Now, law enforcement and the military become tools of domination against the colonized people under the guise of maintaining law and order. Uh, the people thus help create, recreate, and manage a racialized problem population or dangerous class pushed to the margins of the labor market and political priority. Or as some have explained, they maintain the color line. Also, as argued in this analysis, the police shore up these spaces for business growth and expansion. Urban ghettos and urban residents are further displaced or suppressed for the purposes of urban renewal and similar efforts. Now, when considered as a whole, the policies and practices described throughout my conversation today reveal that many poor African Americans are pushed into wretched spaces such as the urban ghetto, symbolically and paternalistically connected to social maladies such as crime, subjected to an influx of police forces of control and subversive supervising their behavior, both inside and outside of the ghetto, for they inflict with police strategies designed to civilize, treated as if their neighborhoods were war zone and financially exploited through fines and displaced via gentrification of urban renewal initiatives for the sake of business growth and development. When considered in collective, these characteristics reflect the colonial occupation of old. Even calling such practices neo-colonial seems inappropriate. These practices are surprisingly colonial in a classical sense. Now, I'll leave you with a suggestion for how we should move forward, in my opinion. My conversation is not the complete picture. Colonialism is an expansive and pervasive structure and process. There are therefore a multitude of colonial dynamics left unexplored in my conversation. In addition to that, various components of policing were not mentioned in my talk for the purposes of brevity, because I know I didn't have a long period of time. For example, researchers have noted that colonialism tends to fill leadership ranks in economic, educational, law enforcement, and military institutions with members of the colonizing population. Racial and ethnic ideological dynamics in the hiring of African Americans within policing agencies may be linked to colonial logics. Future research, I think, should consider the colonial implications of the policing in other racial ethnic groups. The impact of colonial policing on Hispanic and Latino communities, I alluded to throughout my talk, but yet these populations have unique experiences with colonialism in the United States. Contemporary immigration policies, such as the Delegation of Immigration Authority section of 287 Immigration and Naturality Act, commonly known as 287G, are part of a concerted effort to exclude Latina immigrants from the United States, forcing them back towards Central and South American countries, many of which are subjected to imperialistic exploitation by Western countries such as the United States. Such policies allow the heavily racialized policing of our borders against alleged economic and terroristic threats, but many more broadly serve the interests of white capitalism, such as the economic exploitation of Mexico through policies including the North American Free Trade Agreement. Similarly, unique colonial experiences may be evident regarding the policing of Native Americans. Several researchers have noted that the historical and contemporary legacy and circumstances of this relationship between the police and Native American populations, but we need more research in that space as well. Now, we need to take seriously the contemporary and historical linkages between race, policing, as well as structures and processes of colonialism. Rather than viewing such inequalities as stemming from amorphous systems such as racism and social consciousness, colonialism, in my opinion, provides an explanatory mechanism of dialectically nuanced and grounded in historical materialistic formations of contemporary society, including its institutions of social control. The recent crises in American policing are not new developments. They are the products of long-running contradictions in American society. Contradictions and attunement to colonialism helps us unravel. And again, I thank you for allowing me to have this conversation, and hopefully it helps reframe your debate and the positions that you take in understanding how we transform our criminal justice system.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dr. Henderson. I really appreciate you taking the
Thank
time to be
you.
with us today. So we'll have some time for more questions now. Do you think that capitalism is one of, or perhaps the root cause of colonialism?
No, I think you know any system has its benefits and its weaknesses. I think that no matter what system you're in, the poor experience similar realities. Now, there may be a different set of safety nets, but I don't think capitalism is the main culprit. I think it's one of the issues that we have in terms of transforming our criminal justice system. But if you take capitalism out and you put in any other social system or economic system that you want, the people who don't have are more likely to experience police misconduct in this place. And so I don't. So the system seems to not be so much the issue as it is the inability of people to see poor people as worthy of constitutional protections.
Um, so what does, in your opinion, the ideal criminal justice system look like, and what work would it take to get there?
Well, I think that the ideal criminal justice system is one in which people are not unduly harassed by the system. I think that there should be no disproportionalities, more likelihoods. I think that everyone should experience a system in the same nature and extent. I think that the compassion that is experienced by people who have money should be expressed across the board to poor people as well as racial and ethnic minorities, because we do see a compassion system for people who have money. And so I think that we need to figure out how to remove that economic barrier to a compassionate criminal justice system.
What kind of work do you think it would take to get there, or what are the best things
Yeah,
we could do to move forward in
well,
that direction?
one, I think we need to increase the overall professionalization of our criminal justice system. We need to make sure that individuals who work in the system, for example, police officers, I think they should be required to have college degrees. I think that we are long past the point where we could accept police officers who don't have college degrees. We understand that an education, a college degree, reduces the chances and likelihood of use of force by 40%. We understand that officers who have college degrees are more likely to adopt community policing practices, and the list goes on and on. I think that beyond the college degree piece, I think that our training needs to change. I think that essentially we need to be training more for conversational social work type policing, more so than the tactical military style approaches that they have been traditionally trained in. I also think that we have to improve the level of accountability and transparency in police departments. I think that police chiefs need to be held accountable like they would be if they were CEOs of major corporations. They're responsible for all the activity below them. But I think also we need to totally reframe and restructure and re-educate our system, our entire American economy, our American reality. I think a lot of these issues that we have in policing exist outside of policing, as I mentioned, and we fail to address those issues time and time again.
That was a thorough slate of solutions, so thank you. How does colonialism influence the judiciary of our criminal justice system?
Yeah, well, so if you think about if you look at the Supreme Court, for example, um, you tend to see the representation of one or two universities on the court, right, at the federal level. Um, we have a system where if you go to certain law schools, you're more likely to be placed on certain courts. You have a situation where we almost have created a caste system, and the reality shows that social mobility is very limited in the United States compared to other industrialized progressive countries. I think that we have a system whereby you die in the system that you're born in. We also have a system where politics totally dictates the manner in which we place individuals on the bench, and we need to reevaluate that.
Do you think that there should be a different process for putting judges on the bench besides elections?
Yeah, I think we can look at ways, alternative ways of doing that. I think that we need to find a better way to identify who's the best person for the job, more so than what political party is in power placing them on the bench, because we understand that a lot of these positions are for life, and we need to be more serious about how we choose individuals beyond politics.
Do you think that the best solution to that would be to end lifetime term appointments, or do you think maybe there's a different selection process entirely outside of the,
Yeah, I think that's one approach. I think there's several other approaches. I think that if we could identify a panel of the most qualified people and we let Americans decide on who goes to the bench, I think that's the key, because right now it's totally political, and I think that depending upon which party is in office, you have shifts in one direction or the other that shift a little too far for the convention.
certainly. Do you think demilitarizing the police, stuff like ending the 1033 program, would significantly reduce or solve the occurrence of accidents due to excess use of force?
No, I think so. But I also think that even deeper than that, I think that we need to be able to um, deal with police unions and address their power. We need to be able to deal with qualified immunity and police officers' inability to be charged for crimes uh, under the color of law. So there are other pieces, I think, in the collective that would drastically change the system.
Um, how do you think we should address police unions, which is a kind of thorny issue?
Yeah, it's a very thorny issue. That's a tricky piece. I think that uh, contracts need to be renegotiated because I think that in terms of holding officers accountable, research tells us that police unions are in the way of that when they do express misconduct where they should be punished. I think that we're long past the point where we just accept what police unions have to say and what they stand for. I think that we need to reevaluate that and identify those behaviors that should be unacceptable, regardless of union presence or not.
That that makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm not sure if you want to necessarily answer this, because based on your previous answer, it didn't seem like you were suggesting a particular alternative socioeconomic system. But following up on sort of some of your criticisms of the capitalist system, what do you think the alternative is, or what should be fixed? One student asks.
Um, Again, I'm not saying that capitalism is bad. I said it has unintended consequences, and we could debate that, right? But I think that no matter what system, as I said earlier, that you utilize, the people who don't have money, the people who have been racially and ethnically cast into a subservient group are going to have problems no matter what. And I think that the more that we understand different systems, I don't think it's as much about the system as it is about the inability of people who have power to respect the legitimacy of those who don't.
Um, so currently, that has run the slate of questions that I and our participants had. If I'll give kind of a last call for any additional questions for Dr. Henderson. Um, but if there aren't any, I'd like to thank you a ton for being us with here today. I thought your piece was excellent and really informative, and I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to seeing more great work out of the students who are attending. I'm pretty sure they'll be end up in great places.
Oh, actually, just on that nice farewell, we have one more question.
Okay.
It's a broad one. How do you think we can solve economic inequality among minority groups?
Yeah. I think one is so the different angles I'll take on this. One, which is more long term, is dealing with equal education, quality education, right? Because I understand that education has a direct relationship to person's socioeconomic status in most cases. On the other hand, I think that we need to ensure that we are fairly and adequately assessing bank loans for minority groups, that we are helping minority groups stay in homes, maintain quality neighborhoods. We need to deal with mental health. I mean, there's so many different factors that impact financial security beyond just socioeconomic status and education. There are a host of factors that are tailored directly to address these issues, and I think that whatever we can do to maintain a level of stability and overall improvement from that point, I think we're fine. But we're in a situation where a lot of these communities are unstable, and we're needing to deal with those adequately.
Makes sense. I agree. So I guess on that note, then, actually, thank you, Dr. Henderson, and have a great rest of your day. Keep on fighting the good fight.
Hey, we will. Thank you so much. You guys have a great day. Bye bye.
Likewise. Bye.